Well, everyone, hello. Today's lecture on chapter 23 will be presented by PowerPoint. Well, Keynote, because I use an Apple. But that's our sponsor for today. Quite a few years ago, I want to say like maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago, there was a basketball player named, I believe his name was Antoine Williams, I think. I should have had double checked that. But anyways, he was asked during a game once why he took so many threes. And his answer was, because there's no fours. Valid. And that's pretty much an explanation on why I'm not doing this via virtual whiteboard, because there's nothing to draw. This is mainly just information about the different eras and periods that spanned Earth's history. Now, for those of you who are avid NBA watchers who are younger, you may be saying, but wait a second, there's players taking 10, 12 threes a game. Well, I can tell you when I was your age, that was not the case. It was the age of the big man. And taking too many threes was a great way to get on the bench, not on the court. And to know that there's not all of you in this class are fans of sports or basketball. What happened is that they actually made changes to the game that made it harder for defenders to defend against guards. So before they could actually put their hands on the defenders could put their hands on the players to help defend them. Then they changed the rules and they couldn't. So the really great defensive teams of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, like the Detroit Pistons, suddenly their defense was not nearly as effective. And this was done to increase scoring because the casual fan likes to see exciting games where there's lots of scoring. And that's what's happening now. But I know that that has nothing to do with this. All right, so what is our best evidence that of which types of animals and plants or prokaryotes existed during certain time periods? Well, for that, we have to look at what's called sedimentary layers. Sedimentary layers, they're not really rocks. They might look like rocks to the naked eye, but really they're layers of deposits that have collected over time. Now, what you can do in that these areas, it's mainly dried out seas that have layers and layers of sediment that's been caused by things like falling deposits or winds. Is that we see that the sedimentary layers, they build over time. Now, this is not the most beautiful example in the world, but think of dust. Is that if you don't clean your furniture enough, dust will start to collect on top of it. And that's basically a similar thing to sedimentary rock. Is over millions of years, these rock deposits build. And what they do is that they cover up the fossils of plants and animals. So how do we know how old plants and animals are according to sedimentary layers? Well, we have better methods now, like fossil dating, which we'll talk about later. But what we can do, you'll see here that during the earlier eras, is the major continents were basically combined. So if we see similar fossils in similar sedimentary layers, that gives us an idea of which era and period these species existed during. So of course, the deeper the layer, the older the fossil. Now, I do want to note here that we don't always find fossils. Sometimes what we find is sedimentary rock that has the imprint of a fossil. So the fossil might be gone, however, the imprint is still there, which is really just almost as good as the fossil, because it does show us relative size and shape. Now, radiometric dating, how does this work? Well, atoms are in a constant state of change. And this change is just due to was called radioactivity. And what's interesting here is that this concept called half-life, uh, what it is that it's defined by us, and it's the amount of time it takes for half of a certain element to change into a different isotope. So in other words, it's one half its original amount. So what we can do here is, let's say we find a compound. What we can do here is we can actually measure the amount of the original compound that has turned into a different isotope called a daughter product. So what we can do is count the number of half-lives to get an idea of how old the fossil is. Because with half-life is after one half-life, there's 50% of the parent atom left. Two half-lives, there's 25%. So pretty much it keeps on halving until you get extremely small amounts. So you can count the number of half-lives to determine approximately how old um, uh, uh, the thing is. And we see here that different elements have different rates of decay. Usually we go with carbon, because carbon has a relatively short half-life compared to some of the other compounds. So this is the most accurate way of determining the relative age of the fossil or the compound in general. So during this lesson, we're also going to talk about mass extinctions in the history of the Earth, and we'll talk about at the end that there's basically four different causes. One is climate. As you noticed with biodiversity, it's that warmer areas have a different distribution of species, and cooler areas have a different distribution of species. And some of them are really, really sensitive to changes. For example, um, uh, a type of organism that we call an ectotherm, also known as a cold-blooded animal, they rely on um, heat sources in order to maintain their metabolic activity. And if it gets too cold, well, guess what happens to them? They die. Um, and other things is that climate affects things like sea level, because if it gets too cold, then you have the formation of ice caps, lowers the sea levels, and if there's not enough water, well, the organism dies. Other things are asteroid impacts, also known as extraterrestrial activity. No, not the kind of extraterrestrial activity that was responsible for kidnapping Elvis and taking him to some outer space world to entertain the denizens there. No, Elvis was not abducted by aliens, at least not to what we know. But I think it's possible that aliens did abduct Elvis. Look into it more. There's lots of conspiracy theories. Also, increase in oxygen. Yes. So once we got an oxygenated atmosphere, it really allowed for complex animal life to form. Well, actually, that didn't cause a mass extinction. Some species could not survive in a highly oxygenated atmosphere, but it did result in a huge increase in biodiversity. And we can't we can't forget about our friends, the volcanoes. Massive volcanic eruptions, which is you probably have heard the fear mongering that there's going to be a massive volcanic eruption, a super volcanic eruption. Um, I'm blanking out where it is, but if this occurs, then it's going to cause mass eruptions of volcanoes. The climate's going to significantly change because volcanoes emit massive amounts of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. We know by now that excessive amounts of CO2 increase the what's called the greenhouse layer, which allows for more heat to be trapped in the lower parts of the atmosphere, and of course that causes the temperature to rise. So those are the major things that affect life on Earth. I guess if you're going to say the factors for mass extinction, and definitely note this, is that it's going to be the impact of extraterrestrial um, um, masses. It's going to result in climate, or it's caused by climate change, and it's also caused by volcanic activity. Now, we do have a suspected sixth mass extinction event that is caused by humans, which, yeah, so I think that right now saying there's a sixth mass extinction event is a bit early, but we're definitely headed that way. And if another life form happens to come to Earth and they find the same exact data, they're going to look at the sixth mass extinction event and go, what the heck? Because this one is entirely caused by us. It would be the only mass extinction event not caused by one of the three aforementioned factors. It would be caused by humans who have literally destroyed life on Earth so they can get rectangular pieces of paper called money. And yeah, it's really kind of messed up if you think about it. All right, next we have the continental drift theory. So scientists found something pretty interesting, is that they found things like for example, they found similar fossils in different parts of the world. And it's like how could you possibly find a fossil in Japan and then find the same fossil in South America? And that kind of that's just one form of evidence that at one time all the continents were joined together. And the scientist Alfred Wegener, when he came up with this theory, is people laughed him out of the room, because how do large continents, how do they move? It just seemed preposterous. And the idea behind this, though, is that at one time that all the continents were joined together in a giant landmass called Pangaea. So that's really the only thing that could account for things, for some of the similarities that are found between all various different continents. So the idea behind it is a factor called plate tectonics that basically states that the Earth is separated into something called plates. And these plates are constantly moving positions. They're sliding past each other. They're they're going on top of each other, below each other. They're actually separating in order to create new land masses. So that is the idea behind the plate tectonic theory. And there's a very small part of the Earth's mass called the crust. Actually only makes up 1% of the Earth's volume. And it sits on top of a rather liquidy layer called the upper mantle. It's not completely liquid. It's more like a liquidy rock. It's once you get too far subsurface, the physics change a lot. To give you an example, I believe it was Russian scientists. What they did is that they built a giant drill, and I mean a giant drill, that could dig just miles beneath the subsurface. And what they found is that as the drill went through the lithosphere, which is the solid rock that makes up the crust, they started to find that they could not drill any deeper because it turned into more or less a liquid goo. And at that point, they likely started to get near the upper mantle. So when we talk about the Earth's plates, we kind of separate them into part of the crust and part of the mantle. And lithosphere, this is the solid part of the Earth's crust. The asthenosphere, that is like a plastically sort of a goopy layer that is just beneath the lithosphere. But anyways, And something else to notice is that we have two types of crust: continental crust and oceanic crust, and we'll see why that is significant when we get to subduction. But how do these plates move? Well, what happens is that in the upper mantle, the asthenosphere, as I said, the physics get really weird. And we have various moments or periods of heated rock rising closer to the lithosphere, and then it's going to cool and fall. What that does is it creates a treadmill of sorts called a convection cell. So this kind of creates and it's kind of weird. It's like from what I understand, it's like a rock river. It's a rock river that's constantly just circulating. Now, what this does is it actually moves the plates. Yes, it moves the plates of the crust. And what it does is for certain plates, it's going to separate them. So it's actually going to move them away, which is what happens when the continents separate. But if you are going to move a plate one way, what it can do is actually create a gap between the other plates. What this does is it actually will create some underwater volcanoes. And as these plates separate, it's going to create new land masses. And if you see areas where there's lots of islands, well, that is going to be on top of two plates that are what we call diverging. So whenever a plate moves, it's either going to subduct, meaning it's going to go under another plate, or it's going to diverge, meaning that it's actually going to form like a gap, which is going to allow for new land masses to form. So subduction. This is what causes most things to occur, like mountain ranges. So what happens is that the oceanic crust that I talked about before, since it is thinner than the continental crust, when these two tectonic plates, when they begin to move toward each other, the oceanic crust is always going to go under the continental crust, which is going to create something called a subduction zone. Now, when this occurs, it's going to create a gap, which actually is going to allow for magma from the asthenosphere to actually rise up and form volcanoes. Think of it like this. In the subsurface, in the asthenosphere, pressure is so high that this magma actually wants to escape, but it can't because of the solid lithosphere. But in a subduction zone, you kind of create a gap here. You create a slight gap where the oceanic crust is going to go under the continental crust. This slight gap allows for all of that pressurized magma. It gives it a mechanism of escape because this is a weak point that's going to allow the magma to get through. And this is what can build pressure and cause a massive volcano. Now, if there is significant lithosphere here, but there's just enough of a defect for it to burst through, this is what causes more of the violent volcanoes that are responsible for things like the Mount St. Helens explosion. But other times, if there is not much crust here, it's going to form like a shield volcano, which is just where magma just constantly seeps out, or a cinder cone where you just have like a little fireworks show. Those are some common volcanoes in Hawaii. But luckily, the very severe ones, I think they're called composite volcanoes, those are rare, thankfully. Mount St. Helens was so violent that the ashen soot that was propelled into the atmosphere is still there, and planes actually have to fly around it, which is super weird. So there's something called the fossil record. What the fossil record does is it allows us to have a timeline of how certain species, well not species because they change, how certain classes of organisms changed over time. The problem is that there's very, very, very few circumstances where we found actually fossilized living tissue. We actually found a partially preserved mammoth carcass beneath that was frozen in ice because ice freezes decomposing bacteria and prevents them from decomposing the life form. But most of the time, we just find either bones or we find rock imprints, according to the location in the sedimentary layer. However, it is incomplete because some events happened on Earth where fossils were lost. So we kind of have to piece it together based on what we find. And we're always finding new fossils, which allows us to kind of fill in the fossil record and maybe even change what we believe is the proper evolution of life. So mainly we find either bones and teeth, or we find exoskeletons, or we find imprints. The reason why we know that the Earth was first populated by prokaryotes is we actually found their imprints in sedimentary rock. So we didn't find them, we found their imprints. So these are some major events of the different periods and eras that we have classified Earth into. And mainly, what we do is that we separate these periods and eras. We separate the eras by mass extinction, and each era is actually separated into periods. So let's go ahead and talk about the Precambrian era, which was actually pretty long, from 4.6 billion years to 542 million years. And the Precambrian era is broken down into three periods: the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. So let me just tell you, folks, that early Earth was not a nice place. So when the Earth was first formed, about, we think, 4.6 billion years ago, it's kind of funny. When I was in high school, they thought it was more like 3.4, and for whatever reason, in the close to 20 years since it's been since I graduated high school, we tacked on another 1.5 billion years, which is kind of interesting. So because the Earth was first formed, it was very violent. The atmosphere had large amounts of really noxious chemicals like methane and carbon dioxide. It was really hot. There was lots of water vapor in the atmosphere. There were no continents. They were called protocontinents, which were just spread out masses of land. There was no oxygen. Because there was no free oxygen, there was no animal life could form, because of course, as we know now, is we must undergo a process called cellular respiration to make energy and live. That requires oxygen. So because there was no free oxygen, there was no opportunity for multicellular animal life to form. So this was during the Archean era. This was when the first prokaryotes formed. We don't get into this yet, but there was an experiment done by two scientists, Miller and Urey, called the Miller and Urey hypothesis. What they thought is that a chemical reaction involving inorganic compounds was responsible for making organic molecules that were the foundation of life. We think that that was pretty darn close to the truth. We don't think that they were exactly correct on the composition of atmospheric chemicals, but we do think that that kind of reaction had to have made the basis for life. And we think the first genetic material was RNA. You don't need to know that last bit of information, but that's just some FYI. And what happened here, and this is interesting. So during the Archean area, there was a lot of or the evolution of archaea prokaryotes. And they were a class of prokaryote. It's very similar to bacteria, except they could survive in extreme circumstances, like atmosphere, or like areas where there's high amounts of methane, under the ocean, in thermal heat vents, in highly salty environments. But anyway, something happened during an era called the Proterozoic era, or period, apologies, and a large amount of bacteria formed on the bottom of the ocean called cyanobacteria. And this bacteria was autotrophic, meaning that it was capable of undergoing a process where carbon dioxide was used in order to create oxygen. And the conditions were so rife for for these bacteria to become prevalent that they actually created so much oxygen that it created an oxygenated atmosphere. And so this actually created free oxygen in the atmosphere. Also, because of the large amounts of carbon dioxide, we actually got one of the first eukaryotic organisms, and that was algae, because algae actually can survive as a single cell. That's also why algae can become invasive and take over bodies of water. That's because they can exist as a single cell and then form into a multicellular structure. Algae is a protist. We think that even now is that algae, bacteria, plankton, they're responsible for maintaining the bulk of our oxygenated atmosphere. But we apply that to trees because trees are a very good talking point, because saving the trees will kind of spur people to improve their activities for the betterment of the environment. Not many people want to save the plankton or save the algae. So even though algae and plankton and bacteria are responsible for, I think, 70% free oxygen in the atmosphere, we still call trees things like the lungs of the earth, because um, people associate better with trees than they do masses of algae. We also saw the formation of the first glaciers, and that was due mainly to the cooling of the atmosphere. So at the end of the Proterozoic period, is the atmosphere became a little bit more stable. But something happened, and we had the end of the Precambrian era. Thanks to the prevalence of the oxygenated environment, is we were able to we were the the formation of free oxygen as well, due to these autotrophic bacteria. They also created water that was oxygenated. And 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 what happened here is that we actually had the evolution of complex life forms in the oceans. So we didn't really have, and definitely note here, the Ordovician era or period did not result in land life. There was very little land life. So 500 million years ago, the bulk of life was actually found in the oceans. Most of the land masses that were formed were in the southern hemisphere. And if we look here in the Ordovician period, is there was lots of shelled life forms. So very, very basic crustaceans with exoskeletons. They were more simpler life forms. We see here that the plants were very simple. We didn't really have any kind of fish with jaws. And some of these life forms were pretty big, and that's because the large amounts of carbon dioxide in the water allowed for larger shelled animals. So we see that some of these animals were very, very large, and some of these plants as well. But we see here that they were shelled, so there were no bony animals yet. They were very simple in design, and they mainly had shells. So there weren't complex structures like jaws. There were no jawed fish here yet. But this was the beginning of multicellular eukaryotic life. But there were no things like trees yet or anything like that. These were the simplest plants. And this was the first period of what we call the the Cambrian era, and it started with the Ordovician period. So those are the main takeaways from that. Next, we have the Silurian era. And this was the first time where life actually came out of the water and on land. What's interesting too is that chemical reactions caused by photosynthesis, because we actually started to develop more complex plant life, is this actually created something called the ozone layer. So the chemical reaction helped to form the ozone layer. The ozone layer is not the greenhouse layer. The ozone layer sits above the greenhouse layer and neutralizes a very bad type of ultraviolet radiation, and called gamma radiation. So what it does is it prevents this radiation from entering the lower atmosphere, and this type of radiation is so damaging that it can actually destroy cellular DNA. The ozone layer neutralizes that type of really devastating UV radiation. This is not the same UV rays that cause a sunburn. These are the UV rays that kill your cells. So the ozone layer allowed for life to begin to form on land. We also saw the first insects, very basic, and we think that the insects were actually the um, the first land animals to populate the land. Well, obviously. We also saw the formation of jawed vertebrates, meaning that they actually had the ability to open and close their mouths, which made them better predators. And of course, if you are a better predator, then you have a better ability to survive on versus non-jawed fish. Also, we saw the beginning of coral reefs. And this was incredibly important for the evolution of fish because they actually can hide in the coral reefs. So what this did is it allowed them to hide in the coral reefs and then kind of spring out and attack prey. We saw more that the climate continued to fluctuate, and we began to have now the glacial formations that formed during the Ordovician era began to melt, which allowed for the sea levels to rise. And seeing fossils of exoskeletons in the very bottom layers of the sedimentary rock, that gave us some strong evidence that the first land life were indeed insects. So those are the main takeaways of the Silurian era, 443 to 417 million years ago. Next was the Devonian period. And this was, what's significant here was the formation of the giant supercontinent called Pangaea. Also, for the first time, is we had the formation of plants, what we call vascular plants. So things like club mosses, ferns, horsetails, and seed ferns, these are called seedless vascular plants, meaning that they are they have vascularity, so they have like roots and stems, but they cannot make seeds or pollen. So those were the first types of land plants. We also saw more coral reefs form as well. So not only did fish develop jaws, as noted in the Silurian era, Sharks also did as well. So we began to get more complex fish life. And at the end of the Devonian period, there was another mass extinction, and not entirely sure what caused it, but we actually lost 20% of animal species, a family, sorry, and 70-80% of animal species. And mainly this affected um, uh, mainly aquatic life. The reason why, not entirely sure. They think that something might have happened where a period of anoxia began. And anoxia means that oxygen deprivation. Interesting theories behind it. I think probably the one that has the most prevalence is going to be oceanic volcanism, because something had to have put a dramatic amount of carbon dioxide into the water. So something caused a lack of oxygen in bodies of water. They also think that possibly is that we could have had some bacterial activity which depleted the oceanic oxygen. They don't think it was caused by an extraterrestrial body, but the Devonian extinction event, the first major mass extinction. Actually, no, it isn't the first major. It is the second one after the Ordovician extinction, which we didn't talk about too much, but it was caused by rapid cooling and falling sea levels. But we're talking about the Devonian one now. And yeah, something happened, and the oxygen in the major water bodies, for whatever reason, was depleted, possibly by global cooling or volcanism, but still not entirely sure. But definitely note that these are the two leading theories. Also noted during the Devonian period is it got warmer, and they think that the warmth also may have something to do with the periods of anoxia, but again, that's just all theory. So definitely note the changes that happened during the Devonian period, especially with land plants. Oh, also, I forgot to mention that burrowing animals um, and amphibians, they began to form as well. So this was correlated with more diverse life in the oceans, the development of Pangaea, and um, and the diversity of insects and other land life, along with jaw developing and fish and sharks. So now is something called the Carboniferous era, which is named because this was when coal deposits were first formed. So what happened is that during the Carboniferous period, about 306 million years ago was the late Carboniferous era, is that we had giant forests, so to speak, that formed in swamps. So we had very complex plant life now, but they grew in swamps because it was so humid and warm. And whenever it's humid and warm during a period of Earth's history, some of those ice glaciers melt, which causes sea levels to rise, which is going to cover more land in water. So these plants gave off so much oxygen because, of course, photosynthetic activity. What it does is oxygen is a byproduct. Um, because of the increased oxygenated atmosphere, it allowed for larger animal species to form, because there's a correlation between the more oxygen in the atmosphere and the larger and more complex eukaryotic life can be. So because of this, we began to form larger and more complex animal life. From what I understand, the insects during this time were very impressively sized. So we still had seedless vascular plants, but they were larger. And what happened is the reason why these giant coal forests formed is that as these plants died, they actually were not decomposed. The reason why is they think that the extremely hot swamps, well, there's a couple theories behind it. The extremely hot swamps caused the decomposing matter to become condensed and buried, which prevented them from being decomposed. Also, they think that bacteria that could break down plants was not really present yet. Normally what happens is that when plants die is decomposing bacteria, what they'll do, especially in the water, is they'll decompose them and break them down. But we don't think those bacteria evolved quite yet. So when you have extremely hot, muddy um, bodies of water, along with bacteria that cannot break down plants, what's going to happen is it's going to become extremely condensed. Because of that, over time, it formed into a very dense compound called coal. So coal formed in these swampy coal forests. Um, Oil formed in oceans and is the result of not too dissimilar process that allowed for things like algae to become buried subsurface, and that turned more into oil. So no, fossil fuels are not comprised of dinosaur bones. I know that that's a popular theory, but no, it was not comprised of dinosaur bones. It's mainly um, uh, the result of coal forests and algae. So really, algae and ferns that are hundreds of millions of years old could be responsible for the downfall of humanity. What a plot twist, huh? Plot twist in the history of the Earth. Okay, the next period was called the Permian period. And what we actually got here is the beginning of what we call conifers, or also known as gymnosperms. And these were the first types of plants to create seeds and pollen. Also, because it got hotter, we had deserts established, and because it got hotter, uh, amphibians became larger in size, and reptiles began to thrive because when animals are what we call cold-blooded, scientifically they're called ectotherms, is they need a good heat source in order to maintain their metabolism. So we actually saw increased diversity in the reptile and amphibians. We also saw that insect life continued to radiate as well, and we began to see newer species of insects. However, oh, and also, um, these giant forests began to dry out, and we began to have more land and less swampy lands. So also, this marked the end of an era, the Paleozoic era. And the reason why, and we're still not entirely sure of this, but this had the first mass extinction, or the probably the most significant mass extinction that was ever recorded. 96% of all animal species died. So we went from having more advanced biodiversity to suddenly having it almost all wiped out. So what happened is that 96% of all marine species, 70% of all land vertebrate species became extinct. And this one was the only known mass extinction that resulted in the death of insects. So it took a long time for life to come back on Earth, because since so much was wiped out, it took a long time for new species to form, and um, they're pretty sure it was caused by massive amounts of volcanic eruption, which significantly warmed the atmosphere. In fact, they think that there was a 6 degrees Celsius increase, which is a dramatic increase, especially for animals that rely on very specific climate conditions. And 95% of all species were killed, and it took 100 million years for species diversity to return to what was known as normal levels. So this mass extinction at the end of the Permian era was caused by massive volcanoes. Next, we have the Mesozoic, also known as Middle History, spanned 183 million years and was separated into three periods: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Triassic period. And we see here that the continents were still combined, but during this era is these land masses are going to begin to separate. And what happened here is that we actually saw the formation of the first large reptiles, the first dinosaurs, basically. So this was the first era, or the first part of the era, where dinosaurs thrived. We also saw that gymnosperms, also known as well conifers or cone-bearing plants, these became very common during the Triassic period, and they reproduce through seeds and pollen that are stored in cones, which allows them to become more common throughout land, because since these cones can travel and animals like to take cones and drop them off somewhere, is we saw the extreme proliferation of gymnosperms. Plus, since they don't require as much water, it allowed them to thrive in what became a warmer environment. So we saw that we see that at the end of the Triassic period, there was another extinction, and 76% of marine and terrestrial life was killed. But dinosaurs were not in that category. So at the end of the Triassic period, dinosaurs actually began to thrive. Next was the Jurassic period, also known as the Age of Dinosaurs. If you think that you're going to forget that, just think Jurassic Park was not named because the name sounded cool, even though it kind of does. But this was when dinosaurs began to dominate the earth. We also saw that birds developed during this time as well. So during the Jurassic period is when we saw the first birds. The climate was definitely warmer and more tropical, and we saw that Pangaea, the giant supercontinent, was beginning to break apart. So we began to see the start of the first continents. So next is the Cretaceous period, and the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that we saw the development of what's called flowering plants. And these are plants that could form fruit. And of course, fruit is very important. We'll talk about it later. But fruit is very important because it allows for plant species or the flowering plant species to develop over large areas of land. We'll talk about that during a different chapter. This also was the last period for dinosaurs. And we also saw, continuing, that Pangaea was breaking up and forming new continents. So this era is mainly known as the end of the dinosaurs, as well as the beginning of the evolution of flowering plants, which are the most advanced plant life that we still have. We also saw that new types of insects came that actually form symbiotic relationships with flowering plants, such as butterflies and bees. So what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, we're pretty sure that it was caused by an asteroid that hit the Earth with such impact that it actually created giant dust clouds. What happened here is that the dust clouds actually blocked out the sun, believe it or not. That's how much dust and ash and soot was propelled into the atmosphere. So what that did is that it actually prevented sunlight. Well, not all sunlight, but it kind of formed as a barrier that blocked much of the sunlight from penetrating this cloud and allowing plants to do photosynthesis. So plants that required a lot of sunlight in order to survive, they could not exist and they died. So only plants that were more efficient photosynthesizers had the ability to survive with the less sunlight that was getting through the dust clouds. Also, because the sun was blocked, is the temperature cooled down a lot as well. Since dinosaurs were ectotherms, they required a significant amount of heat in order to survive. And plus that, with the reduced plant species, and many dinosaurs actually were herbivores, meaning that they had a diet mainly of plants, is that they couldn't survive without as much food, and there was a mass die out of dinosaurs. So once again, the cooler temperatures, which were not friendly for ectotherms, along with the reduced food supply, was responsible for the mass extinction of dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period. It mainly, though, affected the dinosaurs and many different species of plants. Now, the current era is called the Cenozoic era. Now, there is evidence that there were some mammalian species during the Cretaceous period, but they had a very hard time competing with the giant reptiles, the giant dinosaurs that existed during that time. So, because there were fewer dinosaurs, mammals, and the Cenozoic era is known as the age of the mammal, mammals had a significant advantage over dinosaurs, is that they're not as susceptible to changes in climate. Because mammals are what are called endotherms. Yes, we are endotherms. And we're able to maintain a constant body temperature because we can do things like um, we have adaptations that allow us to raise our body temperature if needed, and we have adaptations that allow us to lower our body temperature if needed. So because mammals were not as affected by the changing climate, and also with the death of dinosaurs, as mammals began to take over. As the atmosphere began to clear and sunlight could again penetrate the earth in large amounts, is we saw that the flowering plants began to evolve more, and different species of flowering plants began to populate the earth. So this was kind of the age of the mammals and birds too, as well as flowering plants. The first period of the Cenozoic era was called the Paleogene era, which was, I guess, the name for the paleo diet or whatever. It occurred 65 million years ago, and the Earth was tropical, so it was very hot. And since the climate was very hot, we had mainly life evolve that was developed in order um, to thrive in tropical regions. So, as I was saying earlier, is that mammals and flowering plants, also known as angiosperms, they were dominating the land, while larger mammals like whales and fish like sharks began to dominate the sea. So the continents existed as we know them now. They were just a little bit closer together. This was also significant because it allowed for these complex mammalian species to go between continents, because if they were close, it allowed for ice bridges to form. And these ice bridges allowed for mammals to travel from one continent to the next. They think that's how wolves began to move between continents because of these ice bridges. Next was the Neogene era. And this one kind of continued what was started during the Paleogene era. Significant here is that the climate began to cool. So this was the beginning of the Ice Age. So it began to get very cool during this time. And we saw the formation of the large glaciers and ice caps. So because of this larger plant life that formed in the very warm Paleogene era, they began to become less prevalent, and instead grasses began to form because they can do better in cool, dry climates. But because of that, grasses are harder to chew than leafy plants. So that's why we saw that many of these successful species during this time, they actually had teeth that were designed for grinding. And also is that they had to develop gut microbiome that could help break down the grass. And this actually led to the development of many common herbivores that we see today, such as sheep. These animals, the herbivores, had to be able to run fast and far. Because of course there were also mammals that were hunters, and were designed to eat the herbivores. Now we also saw that the beginning of what is known as hominids began to populate the earth. These were the first ancestors of humans, and we believe they originated in Africa. And as I said, this was the beginning of the Ice Age. The Quaternary period is the period that we're in now. And we're seeing here, of course, that life at the beginning was very diverse. The end of the Ice Age, which was more the beginning of the Quaternary period, which began 2.6 million years ago, is that many animals that were adapted to colder climates began to die out, such as saber-tooths, mammoths. So they became extinct worldwide, and instead, the animals that could thrive better in warmer environments, like cheetahs and horses and camels, they became more common. So when the Ice Age was beginning to end, and the Earth began to get warmer, that's when we started to see the extinction of some mammals that are popular in literature. Okay, so that is the Quaternary period, also known as the more common period. So we talked about this a bit earlier, but what are some factors that affect biodiversity? Well, climate, of course, because life evolves depending on the climate. For example, plants really like hot, humid, rainy areas. Well, various plants that are designed to thrive in those environments, but also there's plants that are adapted to drier environments, such as cacti. So depending on the climate determines the type of or the characteristics of successful plants and animals. So animals that are adapted more to drier climates, hotter, drier climates, like reptiles, they thrive there. And animals in more tropical climates, they're things like mammals and insects. Volcanic activity, what it does is it spews more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, that makes it less friendly for animal life. But it makes it actually a little bit more friendly for plant life because it puts more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Thankfully, we haven't had a massive volcanic eruption in quite a long time. I want to say in the millions of years. Extraterrestrial events, no, not Mr. E.T., but instead things like large rocks, asteroids that strike the Earth and cause dust and soot to go into the atmosphere and block sunlight, which creates a colder climate, and it reduces the ability for plants to undergo photosynthesis. Also, oxygenation of the atmosphere allowed for complex eukaryotic life to form. The more oxygenated the atmosphere, the larger life forms can develop. Okay, so that is our lecture on chapter 23. Pay attention to the main characteristics that I talked about, because on the exam, for example, I'm going to say something like, this era was the first, or this period was the first period where dinosaurs formed. It was known for land masses that were fused but beginning to separate, and also allowed for the formation of gymnosperms. Name the period. So since the exams are timed, of course, is you don't want to have to go back to your notes and have to go back and read all this trying to answer the question. You'll run out of time. So make sure that you have good notes based on the key points that I talked about in lecture. Okay, well, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all for the next class. All right, over and out.